last week, where we left off, we were talking about what happened in Jerusalem on the Sunday that is commonly known as Palm Sunday. And after we went through the stories from all four Gospels, we concluded that maybe we ought to start calling it Cloak Sunday, because only one Gospel makes specific reference to palms being used, while the other three all talk about the people waving their cloaks and throwing their cloaks down in the pathway in front of Jesus. So the stories conflict on the details. We can at least say that. But there's one thing that we can say with certainty, and that is that Jesus did in fact go to Jerusalem, and the people welcomed him. His reputation had preceded him because he was becoming known as a champion of the oppressed, the outcast, the so-called sinners. He was big on forgiveness, and he believed in breaking down all of those different social barriers that had been set up in that culture back then. And there were even people who were whispering that Jesus might be the legendary Messiah, this person that the prophets had predicted was going to come back and would lead Israel back to its glory days when it was really a regional superpower. The main reason he was really there in Jerusalem on this particular week was because of Passover, which incidentally this year, for the first time in a while, is being celebrated at the same time as we're celebrating Easter. They coincide this year. It was today and was back then one of the main Jewish high holy days of the year. Jerusalem would become the center of attention because everybody wanted to be in Jerusalem where the temple was. That was the most important thing. That was the place where they had been led by Moses and the story that's most familiar from the Passover, the Exodus from Egypt. So it was the capital of their homeland, and it was the place where the temple and the Holy of Holies was located. That's where everyone wanted to be at Passover. So, of course, Jesus chose it to be the location of one of his best-known demonstrations. Now, this was the day after he entered the city. He went to the temple in the morning hours when he knew that it was likely to be full, and that's when he did that thing that we call cleansing the temple, clearing the temple. He challenged the merchants and the money changers who had set up shop there, and he made a big scene, kicked over their tables and threw them out. And here's the story according to the Gospel of Mark. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer of all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And the chief priests and scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. I find it interesting they call it teaching. A lot of times we think that Jesus was just having a hissy fit, right? He was throwing a tantrum. It was a carefully planned demonstration. He was teaching. It's the rhetorical equivalent of pounding your fist on the podium, right? He didn't bring down the temple. All he managed to do was to stop all the business for a few hours. But the most important thing is that he became the center of attention. And he created this teachable moment. Sometimes this incident is portrayed as Jesus condemning the rituals of the Jewish religion. But that's not quite right. Jesus had nothing against spiritual and religious rituals so long as they were serving their intended purpose, which was to bring people together and to offer encouragement and support and justice and things like that. One of the consistent messages that Jesus had, and we see this throughout the Gospels, is that spiritual practices should serve the people, not the other way around. But that wasn't happening in the temple anymore. The temple had become just another facet of Roman domination. It was the place where they collected all of the taxes that were paid as tribute to Rome. It went to Rome after the priests and Herod got their cut. So that's what was happening too. Jesus is shining a spotlight on some serious corruption and hypocrisy. And we know the message got through because it says in that passage we just looked at that the chief priests and the scribes were afraid of him. He was going to cut in on their business. And it says that the crowd was astonished. They were spellbound, it says in another translation. So this is what you would call a throwdown. You can just imagine how this story was spreading through the city. He really knew how to get attention. And he probably also knew that it wouldn't end well. Because the Romans were notoriously impatient with people that they regarded as rabble-rousers. That's how they looked at Jesus. He was a pest. He was causing disturbances. Hey, there was no pesky Bill of Rights or due process back then. People who did things like that were summarily executed. And it was done in such a way as to send an unmistakable message to anyone who was thinking about doing something similar. So Jesus knew what was going to happen. It was like walking into the lion's den and swatting it with a rolled up newspaper. The response was not likely to be what you would call proportional. Crucifixion, a form of government-sponsored terrorism with a message of fear. Don't mess with the Roman government. Create a scene, conduct a political demonstration, you're a dead man. And of course, within days of his demonstration, Jesus became another victim of the ruthless Roman Empire. And his followers had to scramble to make sense of it. That wasn't supposed to happen. Their Messiah wasn't supposed to be executed like a common criminal. And so these stories started to circulate afterwards. They're trying to make meaning out of what had happened. And one of the problems is that none of these stories had any kind of a long-term historical perspective. The back cover went on the Bible right after the book of Revelation. None of the stories tell what happened so much later on than that. There are no stories about what happened 300 years later after Jesus was crucified when the mighty Roman Empire made Christianity an approved religion. Think about that. Not too long after that, they made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, who could have imagined that? The guy they executed for being a nuisance essentially took over the empire posthumously. No stories about that in the Bible. And then, around another 160 years after that, the Western Roman Empire crumbled. It is no more. And yet Christianity is still around. Of course, the only problem was that by the time of the demise of the Roman Empire, Christianity had changed to the point where it had just about nothing in common with how it was practiced in the beginning. The idea of this inclusive community based on ideas of radical equality had gradually morphed into something else. When Karen and I were attending Unity Institute in Kansas City, we got to know a local minister, formerly a Baptist minister by the name of Paul Smith. And he wrote a book here a few years back called Integral Christianity. Here's what he says about how that early, wonderful, radical vision got derailed. He says, Christianity began in Palestine as an experience. It moved to Greece and became a philosophy. It moved to Italy and became an institution. It moved to Europe and became a culture, and it moved to America and became a business. The money changers are back. We've left the experience long behind. So right. And the cold, hard truth is that we can't go back in time as much as we'd like to. We can't go back in time to recapture that experience, whatever it was. And yet, these stories still persist. These stories still persist, in particular, the Easter stories. Well, in Unity, we get to decide for ourselves what the stories mean. Now, we don't have to take them literally. And there are people who are part of more traditional Christian denominations who would agree with us that we don't have to take them literally. One example is from a book called The Last Week by John Dominic Crossan, former Catholic priest, and also Marcus Borg, who was an Episcopalian. Here's what they had to say about the Easter stories. I love this. Believe whatever you want about whether the stories happen this way. Now let's talk about what they mean. If you believe the tomb was empty, fine. Now, what does this story mean? If you believe that Jesus' appearances could have been videotaped, fine. Now, what do these stories mean? And if you're not sure about that, or even if you are quite sure it didn't happen this way, fine. Now, what do these stories mean? That's the question, and there's no one definitive answer to that question. Each Easter here we like to explore the alternatives. And one alternative is that after Good Friday, the followers of Jesus went into hiding. They were terrified. They were defeated. They were demoralized. They were afraid that they were going to be the next ones that the Romans were going to round up for being associated with Jesus. And then the years started to gradually pass by, and they started to realize that none of the things that Jesus had predicted were coming true. He said some very specific things were going to happen during the time that the people listening to him were still alive. Those people were dying off. They started to realize it wasn't happening. If anything, the situation had only gotten worse. The Romans had sacked Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. Israel was no more. Its people no longer had a homeland. That's about as bad as it can get. That was probably the point when they realized that if there was going to be anything like that kingdom of heaven on earth that Jesus always talked about, they were going to have to create it for themselves. They were going to have to embody the things that Jesus had been talking about, especially in the Sermon on the Mount. They were going to have to become poor in spirit, which means not obsessed with wealth, power, possessions, and things like that. They were going to have to become merciful. They were going to have to become peacemakers, champions of justice, forgiving, humble, all of those things. That's how the experience started. With people who decided that the way you live and treat each other is way more important than what you believe. Whatever had really happened to Jesus after the crucifixion, there was one thing we can say for sure. The tomb was empty. All four Gospels agree on that point. The tomb was empty. The human named Jesus may have been dead, but his ideas and teachings were just as alive as ever because people were taking the experience and they were living it. His teachings were just as alive as ever. So the message is stop looking for those ideas in a place reserved for dead things. The tomb is empty. You have to bring those ideas out into the light. You have to breathe life into them by consciously practicing them. Now in Unity, we call that process, we call it Christ consciousness, trying to recapture that living spirit of what was being taught. Turns out that doing that is one of the most difficult things in the world to pull off in the long haul. I think the biggest problem with early Christianity, those early communities of followers of Jesus, they became victims of their own success. When the Roman Empire finally embraced Christianity as the official religion, they said, hey, we've arrived. And the temptation to make a power grab was overwhelming. And instead of continuing to come together in supportive communities that celebrated love, they started arguing about ideology. They started arguing about what was the proper and orthodox way to be a follower of Jesus. The institution becomes the dominant force. Form becomes more important than substance. The persecuted become the persecutors. Crusades, inquisitions, witch hunts, Calvinism, manifest destiny, slavery, war, poverty, hunger, all those things we see. All of the things that will rush in to fill the space where the Christ consciousness or the experience once was. As Paul Smith said, the initial experience had been forgotten. It was like they tried to stuff Jesus back in that tomb. Or rather, they tried to stuff that consciousness back in the tomb, that consciousness that was based on the Beatitudes and the other ethical teachings of Jesus was put back in the tomb. And when that happens, it awaits the next generation who is willing to maybe bring it back into the light again. Yet another resurrection. Every generation gets that invitation. They have the opportunity to do that, which might explain why these stories persist, why they become embedded in our collective consciousness. Might also explain maybe why we're all here this morning instead of reading the Sunday paper over brunch. The world needs us to empty out that tomb again and bring that consciousness back into the light so that it becomes an experience once again. And the really good news is that there's plenty of time to still have brunch. Happy Easter, y'all. See you next week.